Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. No, it's some time here. We are here tonight for EBMUD's Water Wednesday series. Tonight's topic is Drought to Deluge, and we'll also be providing a water supply update. My name is Laura Luong. I'm a community affairs representative at EBMUD. I'll be the host tonight. And let's see, tonight's presentation will be recorded, and we will be posting the video recording to our website and YouTube channel in about a week. And so if you know anyone that missed it, let them know it will be posted in about a week, and they could view that at that time. So tonight we will have a presentation for you. It's brief, and we do have a lot of time left for question and answer, so you can feel free to type in your questions anytime during the presentation in the Q&A box. You could type it in the Q&A box, and we'll answer them after the presentation. So we're going to get started.
Okay, Laura,
okay, go ahead.
Do you want to make any more remarks, Laura, or do you want me to start?
Yeah, I thought I'd introduce you. That's Dave Briggs. He's the Director of Water Operations and Maintenance. And our other presenter tonight is Mike Tagliani, the Director of Water and Natural Resources. And tonight's agenda, I'll go over briefly, is we'll have a California water supply, go over the California water supply, EBMUD water supply, challenges with extreme weather, climate change and water supply planning, and EBMUD's water supply strategy. And now I'll hand it to Dave to get the presentation started.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us, and happy spring. After a very active winter that kept us busy in all sorts of ways, we're all enjoying the weather right now. And also enjoying our 100th year anniversary. So I hope you'll celebrate that with us. And I often think about how lucky we are to celebrate this birthday in a year that was so plentiful over the winter. Much more fun to celebrate this milestone for EBMUD after a wet year and getting out of the drought than if we were still in the drought. The timing of the briefing that Mike and I are going to provide for you tonight is well timed. Our board just yesterday voted, took the last administrative step to end the drought here in our EBMUD service area. And there were many steps along the way through the winter and the spring, but the final step occurred yesterday at our board meeting. And so at this point, there's no formal water restrictions in place. Of course, we always want you to use water wisely, but the formal restrictions were suspended yesterday, as were related surcharges and excessive use charges. So we are out of the drought. Probably not news to everybody, but great news to share. So as Laura mentioned, I'm going to go over a handful of things, starting with the water supply from a statewide perspective, and then get into some things that are specific to EBMUD, along with the challenges here that we faced over the winter, and then hand it off to Mike. And we will be done before the Warriors game starts. Okay, we promise. So, okay, Laura, can you go ahead and advance to the next slide? Okay, so if you were all here over the winter, you know what I'm talking about here and what we experienced. So this graphic it appeared in the Mercury News a few weeks ago or last month, and it was produced by partners of ours in Southern California who are atmospheric scientists. But you can see here that all these arrows represent the atmospheric rivers that essentially pelted the west coast of the United States all winter long. 30 of them, many of them very intense. The most intense one occurred around New Year's Eve with a very intense storm that hit up and down the coast of California and Oregon, southern Oregon. Now, normally, water supply in California, the number of atmospheric rivers we get in California, we usually get 4 or 5. And that's enough to sustain the state in terms of water supply. But having this many is extraordinary. It led to a very wet winter with some records being broken. And yes, there is too much of a good thing, as I'll get into in a moment, but an extraordinary winter. And also point out that many of these atmospheric rivers targeted Southern California. They typically get less precipitation than we do here in Northern California. But most of the records that were broken were in Southern California, and I'll speak a little bit more about that soon. Go ahead, Laura, next one. So this is a graphic produced by the Department of Water Resources, and you can see that it breaks up the Sierra Nevada into 3 sections, and the amount of water content in the snowpack measured every month, near or about the first of the month. You can see that as we got out of the Christmas, New Year's Day storms, we were already well ahead of the game, above 100% of normal in most parts of the Sierra. And as the spring, or as the winter proceeded and we got into spring, the news just kept getting better and better. And wanted to highlight the Southern Sierra number there. That is a record. The water content that is in the Southern Sierra right now is the most that we've ever recorded. That actually will produce some flooding probably later in the spring, which I'll comment on. But just an extraordinarily wet winter, and left us with snowpack totals ranging between 200 and 300% of normal. And also somewhat related to water supply, the wildflower season. If you've been in the foothills or in and around the hills in the Bay Area, I've even heard you can see the wildflowers from space. So just if you're into wildflowers, this is probably the best year you probably can remember. So all in all, a really good year. Go ahead, Laura. So some things that we've seen, just to give you statewide perspective here, that the 3-year drought is over from just about everyone's proclamation. The governor made his own announcements statewide last month, and the federal and state water contracts that are the state and federal government have large water supply projects that they operate and sell water to up and down the state. They are all receiving allocations higher than they've received in quite some time. And even the Colorado Basin, which serves a lot of the Western United States, is having an extraordinary year as well. We don't get a lot of news about the Colorado River here in Northern California, but in Southern California, they are heavily dependent on the Colorado River, and the more plentiful water in that basin that Southern California can take advantage of, the less pressure there is on Northern California, which represents the other half of the southern part of the state's water supply. So we do track all of these things in the Western United States, and all in all, things have been looking pretty good. Go ahead. Okay, so just another metric to give you a sense of how much water does vary in hydrology and the drought cycles and the wet cycles. This is Lake Shasta. This is storage in Lake Shasta. Each vertical line there represents 1 year. And you can see that roughly October 1st or around October 1st represents really the bottoming out of not only Lake Shasta, but most storage reservoirs in California. So at this point, the irrigation season is over. Most of the hot weather season is over. Many of the flows that we put into the rivers to attract salmon have already been put into the river. So the water supply of the state is starting, or the water demand in the state is starting to roll off after a really busy summer. So it really does represent the bottom of our water supply on an annual basis. So you can see that every year it goes up and down. And then also visible are the 3 distinct droughts that we've had in the last 14, 15 years or so. So this is normal. If you go back another 30, 40, 50, 60, 80 years, you're going to see much of this type of pattern repeat itself. Storage goes up and down every year. And every 5 or 10 years, we go through a drought cycle. The other thing to notice here is that it really does take 1 wet year to break us out of that cycle, as you can see. The storage in the state, and again, this is just one reservoir, but it's the state's largest reservoir, and many reservoirs look similar to this. But 1 really wet winter, which typically does follow a drought, and we're pulled right out of it. So even though it does take multiple years to define and get in a drought, 1 real good year can pull us out, and that's very fortunate, and we've seen it time and time again. Okay, so let's just focus a little bit on East Bay Mud for a few slides here. Go ahead, Laura. So the Mokelumne watershed represents about 90% of East Bay Mud's water supply, and so we track that water supply very carefully. And what is shown here is the monthly precipitation we get in that watershed. Precipitation in this context could be rain or snow. The snow is converted into a water equivalent. And you can see here that we have the average months or the largest months of precipitation tend to be in the winter and the early spring. That's the black outlined rectangles, and then the blue represents the actual precipitation that we did receive just this last winter. And you can see that, for example, in the month of December, we almost got triple the amount of average. January was about double, February was average, and March was over double. And overall, we're well above average for the amount of precipitation in this watershed. And even an average year will give East Bay Mud more than enough water supply to meet our customer needs. So this gives you a sense of what we experienced in our watershed. This is in the Central Sierra, so a lot of this type of rainfall and the wet months and even the drier months. April's been relatively dry so far. We haven't had much precipitation in the month of April, but a lot of this is very similar to what we see locally here in the Bay Area. I'll go ahead to the next one. So just getting back to some of the extreme amounts that we saw over the winter. This photograph shows a Caltrans vehicle trying to plow its way through a canyon about 8,000 feet in elevation, so it's pretty high. And if you're a skier, or if you spent some time in the Sierra Nevada over the winter, you know that the snow was measured in tens of feet up there at the higher elevations. So we just had a massive amount of snow. And go to the next one, Laura. This puts a little bit more definition to it. The red line is the amount of snow that we recorded at this upper part of our watershed. So Caples Lake is about 8,000 feet high. It's really far east in our watershed, not too far from Kirkwood. And it does represent a high Sierra elevation for us to monitor snow in our watershed. So the red line is what we recorded this year. And just before I talk too much more about that, just to notice in contrast, the other lines on this graphic show the recent years we've had and how different it is. Look at the blue line at the bottom, which was 2015. That was a pretty bad year. That was not the most recent drought. That was the drought from about 8-10 years ago, the previous drought. And what a difference it can make, a factor of 10 in the amount of snow that we can record in our watershed. It really does make managing the water supply very challenging, and Mike will talk more about that. But this year's snowpack, it was so high that it actually exceeded the height of our gauge that we use to measure the snow. The gauge is mounted at about 165 inches of snow depth, and it went well over that, and we had to essentially estimate the height of the snow above our gauge because we couldn't measure it directly, and we estimated that based on the weight of the snow. So some of these measurements are indirect because there was just too much snow to even measure. Okay, let's see, is that the... Okay, yeah, great. No, that's fine. Go that one, Laura. Okay, so from all of that snow, this graphic just shows how much water comes off the watershed. And so you can see how variable it is from year to year. Now, this year, we're still tallying up the water flow. We still have a great amount of snowpack left. Actually, right now, even though this isn't the highest amount of snow we've ever measured in the watershed, we actually, at this moment in time, we still have a great amount of snow that exceeds most of the year. So we have a lot of water still, or snow, to melt and still come into our reservoirs. So we're estimating at this point how much water we're going to get in our watershed. And that's why we're showing a variable amount there in 2023. If conditions remain dry, we'll be about 1.4 million acre feet. And if conditions get a little bit wetter in the spring, we'll be closer to 1.5 million acre feet of total runoff. But also notice that the prior years were very low, and the most recent drought from 2012 to 2016 was actually worse. We had more years with lower precip, and that drought was even more difficult to manage than the one we just finished. But the red line there shows the average amount of runoff that we get in the Mokelumne watershed. And even an average year is more than enough to meet our needs and other obligations on the river that are below East Bay Mud's diversions. Next slide. So locally, we do have 5 reservoirs locally here operated by East Bay Mud in the East Bay. And so local rainfall helps us as well. And this graphic also just shows how wet it was. The red line shows the amount of rainfall that we've received this year compared to the last 20 years. It's not an all-time record of rainfall in Oakland, but pretty close. I think it's in the top 3 So an extraordinary amount of rainfall that we received. I think the 3-week period between New Year's Eve, December 31st, and roughly January 18th, we averaged an inch of rain a day in Oakland. It was just an unbelievable amount of rain, and I'm pretty sure that 3-week period was a record. Next slide. Okay, so I did mention that yes, there is too much of a good thing, and so even though it has been very wet, it has made some aspects of our lives much easier. It has made water more plentiful. It is still very challenging to operate through extreme weather, especially when we have high flows in the rivers and creeks that fill our reservoirs. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide. But first, just to give you a graphic, and Mike might reference this graphic as well, but just to give you a sense of what how our system is laid out. I did mention that we have about 90% of our supply emanates from the Mokelumne watershed in the Central Sierra. We have 2 large reservoirs there. The water from those reservoirs is conveyed to the Bay Area through about 100 miles of pipeline across the Delta. And then within our service area here in the East Bay, where we serve almost 1.5 million people, almost 1.5 million customers, we have 5 local reservoirs here, and all of those reservoirs filled. In fact, they more than filled. Many of them were spilling into the creeks below and the rivers below, which I'll talk about shortly. Go ahead to the next slide. So just looking at our overall storage here, we're certainly above average. As I mentioned before, even an average year will fill our system. So we're well above average at this point. And the reason why we still have some storage capacity remaining right now after all of that rain and snow, you can see that the Comanche Reservoir is the only place we have available storage right now is in Comanche Reservoir, and that is purposely being held down at a lower storage level because we are anticipating a very large amount of snow to be melting over the next few months, and that will fill that reservoir, and by about July 1st everything will be filled. We do have formal flood obligation responsibilities on the Mokelumne River, and so we are obligated to maintain that storage for flood control, and if we allowed it to fill, the flows in the river below our dams would be very high. And so we're purposely keeping that storage available to capture that snow melt when it happens. Okay, so as I mentioned, that we got a tremendous amount of rain over the winter. And what happens with our local reservoirs when they do fill with that kind of extreme precipitation is the water will fill the reservoir and it will be released onto what we call spillways, which are engineered structures designed just to do this, to release the water after it fills the reservoir in a way that doesn't cause erosion or damage to the dam, but it does produce high flows in the creeks below. So this is a very challenging situation. We do our best to moderate these flows because we don't want them to be too high and impact communities below our dams in the Bay Area. But they are difficult to control because once the reservoir is full, we have limited ability to regulate these flows. And so we work really hard to make them as small as possible and work with all of the downstream entities to make sure we can manage the water when it does come down. Next slide. So the other challenge that we have, other than managing for flood control and high flows when we do get this kind of precipitation, is that from a water quality and a water treatment perspective, this water is very challenging to treat. And so the photograph on the left shows water being released out of Pardee Reservoir, out of the bottom of Pardee Reservoir. And this is typically where we have higher amounts of turbidity. Turbidity is just suspended sediment that happens when we get high flows in the rivers. That water will tend to accumulate at the lower levels of the reservoir. And we like to release it to keep it away from the water that we divert into our water supply. Now, the middle photograph might be a little bit difficult to see, depending on how big your computer screen is, but the flow in the middle coming down from the mountain there is actually flow from our spillway at Pardee Reservoir. That water, as you might be able to tell, is much bluer. It's a much higher quality water, and we like to divert as much of that as possible to our service area, but we can't always do that. Photograph on the right shows sequentially some samples going from right to left of water taken every 2 hours of the Mokelumne River flowing into Pardee, and it just shows it's getting darker and darker as the turbidity is rising. That water is very, very difficult to treat, and it takes a lot of operational skill and maneuvering to try to avoid that high turbidity water so it doesn't get to our treatment plants. When that water does get to our treatment plants, it reduces the production and the ability to produce water. Luckily, it was raining so heavily over the winter that even though this water was difficult to treat and we couldn't produce a lot of water, the rainfall was so steady and so prominent in the East Bay that it really did keep our demand down. Nobody was irrigating. So luckily we didn't have there wasn't a lot of water demand anyway. I think the last slide I have before I turn over to Mike, I just wanted to just point out, this is Tulare Lake. And this is the southernmost area of the San Joaquin Valley, which of course, you might know that all of the San Joaquin Valley used to be a tule marsh, and it flooded very, very frequently, or every winter, really. It doesn't do that anymore because of all the irrigation. But when we do get a tremendous amount of rain, like we got, especially in the Southern Sierra, the Tulare Lake is appearing again. It hasn't appeared in probably 20 or 30 years, but the amount of rainfall that and snow that they got in the Southern Sierra, it's creating this lake. It's going to create some flood damage, and it's probably going to get worse as we get into May and June, as we get the hot weather and all that snow melts. So Tulare Lake doesn't come around very often, but it's going to appear again in the southern Central Valley, and just another indication of an extreme weather condition that we just experienced this last winter. And I think that concludes and hopefully sets the table for Mike to take it over.
Thank you, Dave. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to spend a little time talking about going from what Dave was talking about, which is what things are like now, to the future, and what we do in terms of planning when it comes to thinking not just for next year or the year after, but decades out into the future. And so I'm going to start talking a little bit about climate change and our water supply planning process, and then describe briefly for you all a bit about our water supply portfolio and some of the different elements of our water supply program that we have in place to help us have a resilient and reliable water supply in the future. So thank you, Laura. So when it comes to climate change, there are many projections out there about the potential impacts when it comes to water supply. These are some of the categories that are most significant for a water utility like East Bay MUD. First, of course, there's the driver of temperature increase, which can have an effect on customer demand, evapotranspiration, the amount of water that's necessary for plants, as well as for cooling purposes as well, for, say, industrial uses, for example. Precipitation changes. What's not clear is whether it might be wetter or drier at our particular location as the climate changes. But what we see very clearly is that, and Dave mentioned this, and I'll show you a graphic on it, is that there's an incredible increase in the amount of variability between and you've all experienced this, the very, very dry years, and now these very, very wet years as well. We expect with the temperature increase, we're going to see shifts in the timing of our snow melt. That melt is going to happen earlier and earlier, and there's going to be less snow and more rain in the wintertime. As Dave mentioned, it only takes really an average kind of rainfall year for East Bay MUD to refill its reservoir. But over time, as we move to more rain, less snow, and earlier snow melt, that's going to affect the timing of our operations and how we manage that water as it's coming down off the mountain during the spring. I mentioned evapotranspiration. We're expecting to see an increase in plant uptake as a result of increased temperatures. And then sea level rise. This could be in the range of 1 to 3 feet over the course of this by the end of the century. So next slide. This is a graphic. It's called the Palmer Drought Severity Index, and it's one measure of the severity of droughts that have occurred, in this case, over the last 125 years. And without worrying too much about the scale or the index, what's really important to notice here, the blue are the wetter years, the pink are the dry or drought years, and then those dashed lines kind of represent really extreme events. And if you just eyeball this graphic, you can see it yourself that where in the first 70, even 80 years of this graph, there are a lot of years that fall in between the red dashed line and the blue dashed line. As you move further out, since 1975 or so, you're seeing many more extremes and fewer years falling in between those dashed lines. So what that's telling us is greater variability, and certainly on the dry side of this graphic, we're seeing more frequent and more severe droughts. And we only anticipate that that's going to continue as we move into the future. Next slide. So how do we EBMUD plan for the future? Well, every water district in California develops what's called an urban water management plan. And that's something that's required by the state. It's actually something that EBMUD was doing before it was required by the state. So for decades, we've developed plans to in anticipation of future droughts. And so what an urban water management plan does is it looks at least 30 years into the future. So our last urban water management plan in 2020 looked out to the year 2050 and actually beyond that. And it looked at how our water supplies might change. And it looked at how our water usage, how our customers' usage might change in that planning horizon. And so we analyze climate change. We look at how multiple year droughts will affect us. And in particular, we plan for droughts worse than anything we've ever seen before in EBMUD's history. So as Dave mentioned, we've been around for 100 years. We have data that goes back even a little further than that. But we don't just look at what the worst drought of the past was. We plan for droughts that are even a year or two longer or even more severe, so that we have some ability to be ready for something that's never happened before. And as you know, with climate change, that's something that we can expect. So, so what is the water supply strategy? How are we going to meet those customer needs? What programs and projects need to be in place and by when? Those are the types of questions that we answer in this document. And then we update that document every 5 years. As I mentioned, with our last one was done in 2020. We'll be doing a 2025 update to our urban water management plan, and that will reset our plan for the next 30 years out to 2055 or even 2060. So next slide. So I'm just going to briefly run through some of the key elements of our water supply portfolio. What are the keys to our water supply strategy when it comes to planning for future climate change, extreme drought, and other challenges to water supply reliability? And I like to think of it as really three main elements to that approach. The first is to make the most out of the water that we already use. And that means we want to advance and continue to conserve and use water efficiently and wisely. Secondly, EBMUD has an industry-leading recycle water program. We recycle a significant amount of water for irrigation and industrial use, and our plan is to continue to expand that. Repair leaks, of course, and we are using all kinds of new technologies to identify and repair leaks quickly to minimize water loss. And then in addition to making the most of the water, we want to diversify our water supplies. Dave showed you our map earlier that our primary source of water supply is the Mokelumne River. The secondary source of supply for us today are our local reservoirs, our 5 local reservoirs. But that's not enough. And so we've also developed a project that allows us to access other rivers in the state. So we have a diversion on the Sacramento River that I'll talk about in a minute that also allows us to access water from other rivers like the Feather or the Yuba River and the American as well. In addition to multiple water sources, we are planning jointly with our neighboring water agencies and putting in place interconnections that allow us to have the ability to move water to whichever partner may have the greatest need. But then in addition to diversification, the third strategy is really to take that water that you all are seeing flowing down those creeks and spilling over those dams, and as much as possible, store that water for dry periods, whether it's in a groundwater storage program or in expanded surface water reservoirs. Next slide. So these are just some of the water conservation trends that we are talking about when we talk about expanding our water conservation program. A lot of technology has already been implemented when it comes to low flow shower heads or water efficient washing machines or dishwashers or low flow toilets. And many of those are required by law. So any new appliances or any retrofits of appliances are automatically going to achieve those savings. So we want to focus our program in other places, and that includes outdoor water use, leakage, and then behavioral changes. Really, what drives those behavioral changes is getting out better and better information related to how much water customers are using. So looking at, in the future, looking at information that we can provide to customers so that they can know more quickly how much water they're using and whether they may have a leak themselves. So those we have water management tools in place and are planning for more of those. And all of this comes under a framework where the state of California is more and more actively pushing water agencies to conserve more aggressively. EBMUD's been a leader in water conservation for many years. So up to this point, we've already been able to meet those conservation standards that the state is applying. But going forward into the future, they're going to challenge us as well. So EBMUD is going to need to do more in all of these areas to meet our water conservation goals, to comply with the state requirements, but also because it's an effective way to reduce our overall needs and improve our water supply reliability. Next slide. As I mentioned, we have a comprehensive recycled water program, and that's driven by a recycled water master plan with a goal to reuse 20 million gallons per day by the year 2040. We're currently reusing about 9 million gallons per day. So as I mentioned, for industrial and irrigation purposes, there are opportunities to expand the existing projects. There are some opportunities to implement new projects. And then an important element will be, we're going to be updating that strategic plan, that recycle water strategic plan in the next year, and starting to look at the future possibility of what's called potable reuse, and otherwise highly purifying wastewater to the point that it may be usable as drinking water. That's not currently a part of our plan, but it is something that we're going to at least evaluate in next year's strategic plan. Next slide. I talked about diversification, and this is a photograph of the Freeport Regional Water Project, which, as I mentioned, is our diversion point on the Sacramento River. This is a photograph of the Sacramento River and the Freeport intake. We divert water from this facility only during drought periods. We operated it in 2022. We operated it in 2014 and 2015 as well. It was actually constructed in 2011, so it's been used 3 times in the last, or three years out of the last 12. And that's about what we expected, about 1 year and 3 that we want to operate the Freeport facility to divert water to help us meet our drought needs. Next slide. So where does the water come from that we divert at Freeport? As I mentioned, it's on the Sacramento River. We have a federal contract. Dave was talking about the state and federal projects. which are the large water projects within the state. We have a federal contract that allows us to take water only in dry years for up to about 100,000 acre-feet per year. That's about the capacity of the Freeport Regional Water Project. So to give you some perspective, 100,000 acre-feet per year would be roughly 2/3 of East EBMUD's water supply in the last year, if we had diverted it all from Freeport. So it's a significant source of additional supply and allows us to access other sources of water. In addition to that Central Valley Project contract, we also have purchases that we've done in the past with Placer County Water Agency and are working with other agencies like Yuba Water Agency and Sacramento River Irrigation Districts on purchases, basically purchases of additional water during drought periods that we can bring to our customers to meet our water supply needs during a drought. All right, next slide. An interesting storage project that is underway and being planned right now is the expansion of Los Vaqueros Reservoir. Los Vaqueros Reservoir is in the Brentwood area, and the current reservoir is owned and operated by Contra Costa Water District. But there's a partnership of 8 water agencies, which are shown on this slide, 8 water agencies that represent much of the Bay Area, as well as some additional interest in the Central Valley, that are interested in raising the dam, making it higher, and storing more water in Los Vaqueros Reservoir during wet periods so that it can be accessed for use during dry periods. This project is lined up for a significant grant from the state of California, the California Water Commission grant. That's what CWC grant stands for, of $477 million. So a project that otherwise would have cost $980 million is nearly cut in half with state grant funding. But we're not stopping there. We're also pursuing federal funding that could cover another quarter of the cost of the project. So all in all, it becomes a very cost-effective potential future source of water supply for East EBMUD and all of these other partner agencies. Over the course of the next year, we'll be finalizing some of the plans for this enlargement project and negotiating agreements. And ultimately, the East EBMUD board will be deciding within about a year's time whether or not to be a part of this project. But at the moment, it looks very promising. All right, next slide. And then finally, groundwater storage is an important part of our future program as well. We have very little, almost essentially no significant groundwater sources for East EBMUD at the moment, but we are considering a future in which we store water in groundwater basins in wet periods and make that water available during drought. The largest potential storage basin would be in San Joaquin County. That's an area, our aqueducts from Pardee Reservoir down to the East Bay go right over San Joaquin County and over an overdrafted basin that has been pumped so much that there's more storage available under that groundwater basin than if you added all of East EBMUD's reservoirs up together combined. So there's a significant amount of empty storage at the moment that could be partially filled with water from our aqueducts during wet periods like this, so that we could pump it back out in the dry periods. We also have a project in the East Bay, a much smaller scale. Right now, it's a single well that allows us to store some water in the East Bay for future potential delivery to customers during a drought. All right, next slide. So I'll turn it back over to Laura, who's going to talk about our upcoming 100th anniversary celebration.
Yes, thank you, Dave, and thank you, Mike. We are now, let's see, I'm just trying to make sure I see this. Thank you. So before we get into Q&A, East EBMUD turns 100 next month, and we love to invite you all to join us at Lake Temescal in Oakland on May 21st for a celebration. It's a big birthday party and community fair. We plan to have, there'll be food trucks there, music, a kids zone, you'll be able, the kids and adults will be able to touch a truck, and there'll be a beer and wine garden and prizes. Visit ebmud.com/100party for more information and register for the free tickets. It's a free event. So join us for the party. So now I'm gonna move on to questions. Let me see it. There you go. And if you didn't type in a question tonight, you can email us at any time at waterwednesday@ebmud.com if you have any questions or follow-up after tonight. So I'm gonna get right into it. See, first question we have is, how realistic is using the Freeport project during a drought, given all of the other water districts will be needing water? When we tap Freeport, how much did we use of the 100,000 acre feet? That's
Great question. Either of us can answer, but I'll jump in. Is in fact one of the uncertainties in our long-term water supply is the fact that some of the federal water contract water that we expected would be available has not been available in the quantities that we had anticipated. So that means we're going to need to look for other sources. And that's part of why we've developed this water transfer program. So when the federal water is not available, we can then turn to these other relationships and these other partners we have so that we can purchase water from other water districts that have water rights and effectively move a significant amount of water. We've not needed to divert 100,000 acre feet of water so far during a drought. That would be operating the Freeport project every day of the year for 365 days. We've taken, last year we took, in the spring of 2022, we took around 31,000 acre feet of water. And then in, I think it was October and November, we took another 20,000 acre feet of water. So overall, last year in 2022 calendar year, we took about a little over 50,000 acre feet of water to help meet our customers' need. And that extra, and it costs money, of course, to pump the water from the Sacramento River all the way to the East Bay. So when our board approved an increase in water rates, specifically for a drought surcharge of 8%, that the money that was raised was specifically raised to pay for that water and the pumping of that water to the East Bay. And so now, of course, that 8% drought surcharge was ended in March once we had secured enough funding to cover the cost of the water that was purchased and diverted.
okay. Thank you, Mike. The next question we have, are native plants and habitats being protected during expansion? And this was asked during the Los Vaqueros slide.
Okay. Yes. So the partnership and working together with Contra Costa Water District has completed an environmental environmental impact statement, or excuse me, environmental impact report, an EIR. And there's also quite a bit of permitting that's required. One of the advantages of expanding an existing reservoir rather than building a new reservoir is it greatly reduces the increased footprint and potential impact on species. So that's why this type of alternative was preferred over building a separate new reservoir. And there are, as a part of that, back on that environmental impact report, there are different mitigations that are in place to deal with any specific impact that's determined to be significant.
Thank you. The next question is, on another call, this customer thought he heard that East Bay mud recharges aquifers, but it sounds like we don't have much groundwater. Is that correct?
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, sorry, Dave. I'm hogging the questions for now. East Bay Mud completed a groundwater sustainability plan for the East Bay Plain, which is the area west of the Hayward Fault, and it runs from San Pablo down to Hayward. That groundwater basin does have some potential development, but it is relatively small compared to the scale of how much water we deliver to all our customers. So East Bay Mud itself does not have tremendous groundwater resources at the scale of what we would normally use, but there are some. So there is some potential to develop them in the future. And it's been really, we've made kind of some slow progress there. In San Joaquin County, that's not within our service area. So we have to work in partnership with the growers, the irrigation districts, the water right holders in that community in developing a groundwater storage project where we put water in the ground. Some of it stays behind for those local community members, and some of it could come to the East Bay during the drought. And we've been working through building that trust and that partnership for many years, and it's honestly moving in a very positive direction at the moment. But to answer the question, yes, our supplies are limited. We have done some piloting and some recharge. So in San Joaquin County, we put some water in the ground and taken a small amount out. And in the East Bay, we put some water, a small amount of water in the ground, but we have not taken any of the water out from the East Bay yet.
Okay, thank you. This is the next question is, do we know if Shasta Dam / lake will be raised?
Let's see. So Shasta-Reservoir is a federal facility owned by the Bureau of Reclamation, and they have been looking at expanding that reservoir for decades. It's extraordinarily expensive to do that. Of course, the water supply benefit would also be large as well, so it might be cost effective. But there's a lot of mitigation involved with expanding that reservoir, including potentially moving and relocating I-5, Interstate 5. So as far as I know, that's still actively being pursued by the Bureau of Reclamation. I don't know if it will ever become a reality.
Thank you. And this customer wants to know, is there an effort to meter all water consumption in the state, whether paid for or entitled, to at least gather all consumption data? And what about charging the same amount for a given quantity of water, regardless of how it is used or how much is consumed?
Let's see. So most definitely there is an effort to meter all consumed water and to calibrate those meters so that we know that those measurements are accurate. The state has done amazing work in the last 10 or 20 years, insisting and regulating and making it a requirement to meter water use. There were communities throughout California that had unmetered use, Sacramento being the best example, but meters are required in California. Because the state recognizes how valuable that information is when they try to regulate conservation and wise water use at a statewide level. So that has absolutely been an area of focus in the last few years, and that data is necessary, absolutely. In terms of the cost of the water, charging the same amount, well, we don't get all of our water from the same place. Depending on what service area you are in, the cost of providing that water to you will vary. It depends on the infrastructure involved. It depends on how much needs to be rehabilitated and how costly it is to treat that water and find that water or buy that water. So everybody pays a different amount depending on where you live in California. That's just a fact of life. I don't see that changing while we have 450 water districts in California.
Okay, thank you, Dave. One more question. Since all reservoirs will be full, shouldn't you be encouraging customers to use more water to raise revenues instead of having the water spilling into the bay?
Well, we always encourage people to use water wisely. And there is a great amount of ecological benefit associated with leaving the water in the river, in whether it's the bay or not, and all sorts of benefits that happen when the water stays in the creeks and the rivers. So we want people to use water wisely. We're glad our reservoirs are full, and we basically charge the cost of service. So regardless of how much people buy, we're going to just collect enough to recover our costs.
Okay, and then we're going to go into this last question. There was a state proposition about 10 years ago to increase storage, but progress has been slow. Is anything done to accelerate the progress?
Yeah, so I think I believe you're referring to Proposition 1, which is the funding source for the Los Vaqueros Reservoir enlargement. So I think every single storage project has its own challenges. Los Vaqueros Reservoir is going to be one of the first ones that's completed because it does not have quite as many challenges as some of the other potential projects. Every single one is difficult. And when we're talking about water supply development, we're often talking about decades to get things done. So while, you know, certainly it's fair to question why things can't happen faster. There are, you know, environmental permitting processes and financial considerations that have to be taken into account when you consider developing projects of this magnitude. These are not just small single water agency dam projects. These are huge partnerships and hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars being spent. So we want to be sure it's being spent well and wisely, and that all the environmental considerations are addressed as well. So yes, it could it happen faster? Maybe, but I feel like from my perspective, any kind of process to develop projects of this magnitude with this many partners is just going to take a long time. And I'm optimistic, at least for Los Vaqueros, that we'll have a project completed with construction done by about 2030.
Okay, thank you, Mike. That's all the time we have for questions tonight. If we didn't get to your question, please email us at waterwednesday@ebmud.com. And if you have any questions, think of anything after this meeting, feel free to email us. And again, encourage you to, I don't know how to get that. Okay, encourage you to visit ebmud.com/100party and see if you are available that day to join us for the celebration. Again, I'd like to thank our panelists for being here tonight, Dave Briggs and Mike Togolini. Thank you, and everyone. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.